The first grenade went off in Captain Tadashi Suzuki's mind, not his hand. He'd hidden it in his uniform on Iwo Jima, wrapped in cloth against his ribs. The plan was simple. Wait until the American demons came close, then detonate it. Take 3 or 4 of them with him. Die as a warrior should. The Senjin-kun code was clear. Capture meant eternal shame for his entire family. His mother would never hold her head up again. His name would be erased from the family shrine. But the Americans didn't come with knives and pliers like his officers had promised. They came with stretchers. Suzuki had been shot through the thigh. He'd crawled into a cave with 14 other wounded men, all clutching grenades, all ready for the final moment. They heard boots outside. American voices. This was it. The torture would begin. A Marine appeared in the cave entrance. Young kid, maybe 20. He saw 15 armed Japanese soldiers in the shadows. He lowered his rifle. "Medic!" the Marine shouted. "We got wounded." Suzuki's hand tightened on the grenade. This was the trick. They'd pretend to help. Then the real horror would start. Everyone knew what Americans did to prisoners. The stories were specific. Eyes gouged out. Fingers removed one by one. Bodies dragged through streets while crowds threw stones. But then the medic arrived. An American corpsman named Willis. He crawled into that cave, into a space with 15 enemy soldiers, carrying nothing but a medical bag. Willis looked at Suzuki's leg. The wound was bad, bone visible, infection already spreading. Back in the Imperial Army, they would have left him to die. Resources were too scarce to waste on the wounded. Willis started cleaning the wound. Suzuki tried to speak, to curse him, to trigger the grenade. But the morphine hit his system and his hand went slack. The grenade rolled away. Willis didn't even flinch. He just kept working, talking in soft English that Suzuki couldn't understand. His hands gentle on infected flesh. "Easy, buddy," Willis kept saying. "You're gonna be okay." 3 hours later, Suzuki woke up in an aid station. His leg was bandaged. An IV drip fed fluid into his arm. He was alive, unharmed, and absolutely terrified because nothing he'd been taught was true. Then a guard brought him food. Not scraps, not prison rations. A full metal tray with beef stew, bread, canned peaches, and coffee. More food than Suzuki had seen in 6 months. On Iwo Jima, Japanese soldiers were eating grass and seaweed. Here, as a prisoner, he was staring at a feast. "Some kind of torture," he whispered in Japanese. "They fatten us before the killing." But the killing never came. Instead, every day, 3 times a day, the food appeared. American guards ate from the same pots, drank the same coffee. No separate rations. No poisoning. Just food. Glorious, abundant, impossible food. By the 3rd day, Suzuki had gained 4 pounds. His leg infection was clearing. An American doctor, real doctor, not a medic, checked on him twice daily. The doctor spoke some Japanese, enough to say, "You fought bravely. Now rest. Heal." Suzuki started to understand something that would have gotten him executed a week earlier. The Americans weren't demons. They were just men. Men who followed rules that protected even their enemies. This wasn't happening to just Suzuki. Across the Pacific, in early 1945, the same impossible scene was repeating. On Okinawa, Luzon, Iwo Jima, anywhere Japanese soldiers fell into American hands, the torture never materialized. Instead, there was food, medical care, shelter, treatment that exceeded anything the Geneva Convention required. The statistics were impossible to believe. At the start of the war, only 1.1% of Japanese soldiers surrendered. Out of 2,500 defenders on Attu Island, only 28 gave up. The rest chose death, suicide charges, grenade clutching, anything but the shame of capture. The Imperial Japanese Army had spent decades preparing soldiers for this. Instructions for the battlefield explicitly stated, "Do not suffer the shame of being taken alive." Mothers on Saipan threw their babies off cliffs rather than let Americans touch them. The propaganda was specific, detailed, horrifying. Americans would rape, torture, mutilate. Death was preferable. Every Japanese soldier believed this. It wasn't a guess or a fear. It was doctrine, drilled into them from childhood. Surrender was worse than death. Surrender destroyed your family's honor for generations. But by August 1945, something impossible happened. The surrender rate hit 35%. 35%. More than 1 in 3 Japanese soldiers chose American captivity over death. Tens of thousands of men, indoctrinated from birth to die rather than surrender, chose to live in enemy hands. What changed? One thing. Americans proved through actions that everything the Japanese military had told its soldiers was a lie. The food was real. Private First Class Hideo Kubota, captured on Okinawa, remembered his first meal at Camp Livingston, Louisiana. Meat, vegetables, bread. More food than I had seen in a year. The American guard, he took food from the same pot and ate with us. I thought it was poison, but he was eating it too. The medical care was real. Corporal Masao Watanabe, captured in the Philippines, watched an American doctor spend an hour treating an infection in his leg. 1 hour, for an enemy soldier. He called me son. He said, "You fought bravely. Now let us help you heal." I had been taught Americans were barbaric. This man had tears in his eyes when he cleaned my wound. The respect was real. Lieutenant Colonel Sherwood Dixon, commandant at Camp McCoy, Wisconsin, issued orders that shocked his own officers. These men fought honorably within their understanding. They will be treated with respect. Respect. For an enemy that had attacked Pearl Harbor without warning. For soldiers who had committed atrocities across Asia. For men whose comrades had tortured and killed American POWs in camps where the mortality rate hit 40%. Some American soldiers thought Dixon was crazy. Some thought it was weakness. But Dixon understood something about the American character that would win more victories than bullets. We prove we're better by being better, not by talking about it. So America spent $3.50 per day per Japanese prisoner. In 1945 dollars. That's equivalent to $58 today. More than what the U.S. had spent on Confederate POWs. More than what British camps spent on German prisoners in WWI. America gave enemy soldiers better treatment than we'd given our own countrymen in previous conflicts. The Japanese Imperial Army had been feeding its combat troops, Pompei, 2,000 calories per day. American POW camps provided 4,000 calories, the exact same ration as an American GI. Not similar, identical. A Japanese prisoner in Louisiana ate the same food as an American soldier in France. Let that sink in. The U.S. military decided that feeding enemy prisoners the same as American troops was the right thing to do. Not the easy thing. Not the cheap thing. The right thing. By May 1945, Japanese prisoners were gaining weight. Men who'd been starving in caves, eating tree bark and insects, were putting on healthy pounds. Medical officers documented it. Average weight gain of 15 pounds in the first month of captivity. Wounds healing. Diseases clearing. At Camp Shelby, Mississippi, Warrant Officer Kiyoshi Ogawa arrived weighing 128 pounds. 6 months later, 171 pounds. He stood in front of a mirror and didn't recognize himself. The skeleton was gone. In its place was a healthy man who'd been told he would die in shame, but was instead living in dignity. The propaganda hadn't just been wrong. It had been the opposite of truth. Captain Suzuki, lying in that aid station on Iwo Jima, realized something that would haunt and heal him for the rest of his life. I had been taught that Americans would gouge out my eyes, cut off my fingers one by one, parade me through the streets. When I was captured, I was ready to die. I wanted to die. Instead, they were decent. Decent. That one word contained a revolution, because decency wasn't in the Japanese military code. Honor, yes. Courage, absolutely. Loyalty to death. But decency to enemies? That was weakness. That was corruption. That was the lie that soft nations told themselves before warriors crushed them. Except here were the Americans, victorious Americans, practicing decency like it was strength. And it was working. Word spread through Japanese units still fighting. Whispers at first, then louder. Americans don't torture prisoners. They feed them, give them medicine, treat wounds. The officers said it was propaganda, lies meant to make soldiers weak. But the officers couldn't explain why prisoners who'd been recaptured, men who'd escaped from American custody and been caught again by Japanese forces, confirmed it. The Americans had treated them well. Some Japanese commanders executed these men for spreading defeatist lies, but the truth was spreading faster than bullets could stop it. By summer 1945, Japanese soldiers on Okinawa were surrendering in groups, not just wounded stragglers, but whole units, men who could have kept fighting but chose American captivity instead. The Japanese military leadership panicked. Their most powerful weapon, fanatical devotion unto death, was being disarmed by something as simple as 3 meals a day and medical care. How do you fight an enemy who defeats you by being humane? The answer, it turned out, was you couldn't. Because America wasn't just defeating Japan's military. America was defeating the lie that had sustained Japanese militarism. The lie that might made right. That cruelty was strength. That treating enemies with dignity was weakness. Every Japanese prisoner who gained weight, every wound that healed, every man who wrote home saying, "The Americans are not what we were told." Each one was a bullet fired at the heart of imperial ideology. And America had 50,000 of these walking, talking, well-fed contradictions by war's end. 50,000 men who'd been taught Americans were demons and learned through daily proof that Americans were just people trying to live up to ideals that actually meant something. This wasn't mercy. This was power. The tent flaps opened and Private First Class Hideo Kubota saw hell. Not the hell he'd been promised. American demons with torture implements. But something that violated everything he understood about the universe. The mess tent at Camp Livingston, Louisiana, stretched 100 feet long. Metal trays lined the serving tables. The smell hit him first. Roasted meat. Real meat. Not the watery rice gruel the Imperial Japanese Army called a meal. Not the rotten horseflesh his unit had eaten on Okinawa. Actual beef. The American sergeant pointed to the line. Kubota shuffled forward with 40 other prisoners, certain this was the prelude to execution. They would feed condemned men one last meal before the torture began. He held out his tray. An American cook, a black soldier, which shocked Kubota further, dropped a portion of meat onto it. Then vegetables. Then bread. A second cook added potatoes. A third spooned gravy over everything. Kubota stared at his tray. More food than he'd seen in a year. More food than a Japanese private received in a month. "Keep moving, buddy," the sergeant said through an interpreter. Buddy. The word meant friend. They called their enemies friend. The prisoners sat at long tables. Kubota examined his food for poison. He watched the American guards. They were eating from the same serving line. The same meat. The same portions. They weren't eating separately or better. They were eating identical rations. An American corporal sat at the end of Kubota's table. The man took a bite of meat, smiled, gave a thumbs up. Then he started eating. Kubota lifted a piece of beef to his mouth. The flavor exploded across his tongue. He hadn't realized how close to starvation he'd been until this moment. His hands shook. Tears streamed down his face as he ate. Around him, other prisoners wept silently as they consumed the meal. Several vomited, their shrunken stomachs unable to process real food after months of deprivation. The American medics rushed over with water and crackers. "Easy, easy," they said. "Small bites. Your stomach needs time." They weren't angry about the vomit. They were concerned, worried about the health of enemy soldiers who'd been trying to kill them weeks earlier. The Imperial Japanese Army fed its soldiers 2,000 calories per day. That was the official ration, when supplies were available. In reality, frontline troops often received far less. On Okinawa, Kubota's unit had subsisted on 800 calories daily for 6 weeks before the battle. Men had gnawed on grass. Some had eaten their leather boots. American POW camps provided 4,000 calories per day, the exact same ration as American GIs received. Let that sink in. The United States fed enemy prisoners, men who'd committed atrocities against American soldiers, better than Japan fed its own warriors. This wasn't just kindness. This was proof that everything the Japanese military had taught its soldiers was a lie. Lieutenant Colonel Sherwood Dixon at Camp McCoy, Wisconsin, implemented a radical policy documented in his official reports. Every Japanese prisoner would receive medical screening, dental care, adequate clothing, and rations consistent with American standards of human dignity. His exact words to skeptical subordinates: "These men fought honorably within their understanding. They will be treated with respect." The cost was staggering. The U.S. military spent $3.50 per prisoner per day, equivalent to $58 in today's money. For context, Confederate prisoners during the Civil War received roughly $50 per day in equivalent value. German POWs in World War I received $1.20 per day equivalent. America was spending more to feed its worst enemies than it had spent on its own countrymen in previous conflicts. By June 1945, the average Japanese POW in American custody gained 23 pounds in the first 3 months of captivity. Private Masashi Ito arrived at Camp Shelby, weighing 127 pounds at 5'6". 3 months later, he weighed 163 pounds. He told Army interviewers through a translator, "I thought I was dying on Luzon. My ribs showed through my skin. Here, I am healthier than I was before the war began. How is this possible? Why would Americans do this?" Camp Clarinda, Iowa, held 3,000 Japanese POWs by spring 1945. Among them was Corporal Masao Watanabe, captured in the Philippines with an infected leg wound that had turned gangrenous. The Japanese Army Medical Corps had abandoned him when his unit retreated. His own comrades left him to die because he couldn't march. American medics evacuated him to a field hospital. They pumped him full of sulfa drugs. They debrided the wound. They saved the leg. At Camp Clarinda, the infection returned. Watanabe assumed they would amputate or let him die. He was useless now, a crippled prisoner consuming resources. Instead, Captain William Morrison, MD, U.S. Army Medical Corps, spent 1 hour cleaning and treating the wound. Morrison was 32 years old, a surgeon from Des Moines who'd treated wounded Marines at Guadalcanal. He'd seen what Japanese soldiers did to captured medics. He knew about the medical experiments. He'd read the intelligence reports. He treated Watanabe with the same care he'd shown American soldiers. "You fought bravely," Morrison said through the interpreter as he worked. "Now, let us help you heal," Watanabe later wrote in a letter preserved by the National Archives. "The American doctor had tears in his eyes when he cleaned my wound. Tears. For an enemy. I had been taught Americans were barbaric. This man called me son. He said my mother would want him to care for me. I could not understand. In the Japanese army, wounded soldiers were burdens. Here I was, valued." Morrison's treatment log shows he spent equal time with POW patients and American soldiers recovering from combat injuries. He made no distinction. A wound was a wound. A patient was a patient. This wasn't Morrison being exceptional. This was American military policy, enforced from the Pentagon down to every camp. Medical care for POWs had to meet the same standards as care for American personnel. The Geneva Convention required basic care. America provided advanced care. Japanese prisoners received dental work. They received eyeglasses. They received treatment for tropical diseases contracted fighting for Japan. At Camp Huntsville, Texas, a Japanese POW with appendicitis received the same emergency surgery an American soldier would receive, performed by the same surgeon who'd operated on wounded GIs 2 days earlier. Sergeant Shoichi Sato told Army historians after the war, "I had malaria. The Americans gave me quinine and hospitalized me for 2 weeks. In the Japanese Army, sick soldiers were told to fight through it or die trying. Here, they cared whether I lived or died. Why? I was their enemy." The food and medical care created an impossible cognitive dissonance for Japanese prisoners. Their entire worldview rested on the superiority of Japanese spiritual strength over American material weakness. They'd been taught that Americans were soft, decadent, unable to endure hardship. That's why Japan would win. Spiritual power would overcome physical abundance. But here was the truth American POW camps revealed. Abundance wasn't weakness. It was strength. And America chose to share that strength even with enemies who'd shown no mercy. Private First Class Hideo Kubota's transformation happened over 8 meals. The first meal, he was certain he'd be poisoned. The second, he noticed the guards ate the same food. The third, he saw sick prisoners being taken to the hospital and returning healthy. The fourth, he watched American soldiers laughing with Japanese prisoners who were learning English phrases. The fifth, he accepted this wasn't a temporary trick. The sixth, he felt shame for believing the propaganda. The seventh, he felt anger at his own leaders for lying. The eighth, he felt something unprecedented, hope. By the second week, Kubota told interrogators, I understood everything I'd been taught was false. Americans weren't demons. My own commanders were the demons. They'd sent us to die for lies while they ate real food in Tokyo. The Americans gave me more dignity as a prisoner than Japan gave me as a soldier. This realization spread through every camp. When new prisoners arrived, still terrified, still indoctrinated, the veteran POWs told them the truth. The Americans will feed you. They will heal you. They will not torture you. Everything we were taught was a lie. Word leaked back to Japanese lines through escaped prisoners, through radio intercepts, through intelligence channels. The Japanese military leadership tried desperately to suppress the information. In April 1945, a Japanese soldier on Okinawa was caught with a letter from his brother, a POW at Camp McCoy. The letter described the food, the medical care, the respect. The soldier's commander ordered him executed for possessing defeatist propaganda. But you can't execute information once it spreads. By May 1945, entire Japanese units on Okinawa were surrendering in groups, something unthinkable 6 months earlier. Commanders reported finding defeatist leaflets that weren't American propaganda drops, but handwritten notes from Japanese soldiers describing POW camp conditions. The surrender rate was climbing from 1.1% toward 35% because of a radical American strategy. Tell the truth. Treat prisoners well. Prove through actions that American values weren't propaganda. They were real. Major Robert Kenworthy, who would later orchestrate the famous shared dinner at Camp Shelby, wrote to his wife in June 1945, "We're winning a second war here, Helen. Not with bullets, but with kindness. These prisoners arrived expecting torture. They're leaving as witnesses to American decency. Every man we treat well is a living contradiction to everything Japan told its people about us." Kenworthy understood something profound: the psychological impact of feeding starving enemies, healing wounded enemies, respecting defeated enemies. Each act of decency was a weapon against the ideology that made Japanese soldiers fight to the death. The Japanese military had built its power on a simple premise: death before dishonor. America destroyed that premise by proving that surrender didn't mean dishonor. It meant survival, dignity, and a future. The mortality rate in American POW camps for Japanese prisoners was 1.6%. Most of those deaths came from wounds sustained before capture or diseases contracted before imprisonment. The barrack walls at Camp Livingston carried something more dangerous than razor wire. They carried hope. Private First Class Hideo Kubota sat on his bunk in July 1945, holding a stub of pencil and forbidden paper. Around him, 23 other Japanese POWs waited in silence. Outside, guards walked their perimeter, but they walked slowly, deliberately giving the prisoners time. Kubota wrote in careful Japanese characters, "The Americans feed us meat every day. They have machines that wash clothes. They gave me new teeth." He paused, then added the line that would change everything. "They treat us better than our own officers did." This wasn't just contraband. This was treason. And it was about to become the most effective psychological weapon in American history. By August 1945, American commanders faced an impossible problem. 50,000 Japanese POWs sat in camps across the United States, physically healthy but spiritually shattered. Men who had been taught since childhood that their emperor was divine, that Americans were demons, that death was preferable to the eternal shame of capture. You couldn't just feed them and expect healing. You couldn't order pride back into existence. The solution required something no military doctrine could teach. You had to give broken men a reason to believe in their own humanity again. Colonel Donald Nugent, overseeing POW operations at the Pentagon, understood the stakes. "These men are walking proof of everything we say about ourselves," he told his staff in June 1940. "Every prisoner who goes home believing American values are real is worth 10 propaganda broadcasts. Every prisoner who remains convinced we're monsters is a recruitment tool for the next war." The numbers backed him up. Intelligence reports from Okinawa showed something unprecedented: whole Japanese units surrendering together after receiving notes from POWs describing camp conditions. The Imperial Army was executing soldiers caught with such letters, but they kept coming. By late July, American forward positions were finding 5 to 10 Japanese soldiers surrendering daily with crude English phrases learned from smuggled notes. "Food good. No torture. Want live." But physical survival wasn't enough. The real battle was ideological. Captain Thomas Brennan saw it firsthand at Camp Shelby, Mississippi. He supervised 1,200 Japanese POWs who moved through their days like ghosts. They ate the abundant food. They attended medical checkups. They participated in mandatory exercise. But they never spoke unless required. They never smiled. They never looked guards in the eyes. It was like watching men who'd already died, Brennan wrote in his journal. They were breathing, eating, functioning, but there was nothing behind their eyes. They'd been taught that capture meant spiritual death, and they'd internalized that teaching so completely that being physically alive seemed almost irrelevant. The traditional military response would have been discipline and routine. Keep prisoners fed, healthy, and controlled until the war ended and repatriation could begin. But Major Robert Kenworthy, Brennan's commanding officer, believed in something more radical. Kenworthy had grown up in Montana, the son of a rancher who taught him that men and cattle both responded to the same basic psychology. Treat them with respect, show them they're valued, and they'll follow you anywhere. Treat them like animals, and they'll never trust you. It was a cowboy's philosophy applied to international warfare, and it was about to change everything. On August 12, 1945, 3 days before Japan's surrender, Kenworthy gathered his staff. "We're going to do something different," he announced. "We're going to prove to these men that the war is actually over." His plan violated half a dozen Army regulations. It required authorization he didn't have. It could end his career if it went wrong. He ordered it anyway. August 15, 1945. Camp Shelby Evening Formation. 1,200 Japanese POWs stood in perfect ranks as the sun set over Mississippi. They'd been assembled for what they assumed was a routine announcement. Instead, They watched American guards setting up tables in the open yard between barracks. Not mess hall tables. Not separate prisoner tables. Shared tables. Long wooden tables with benches on both sides. Warrant Officer Kiyoshi Ogawa stood in the front rank, confusion replacing his usual blank acceptance. In 18 months of captivity, he'd learned to expect American efficiency, American abundance, even American kindness. But this made no sense. Guards and prisoners didn't eat together. That wasn't how armies worked. Then, Major Kenworthy stepped forward, and Ogawa's confusion turned to shock. The American officer wasn't in uniform. He wore civilian clothes, slacks, and a simple button-down shirt. He stood before 1,200 enemy soldiers, looking like someone's father about to host a Sunday dinner. Through an interpreter, Kenworthy spoke. "The war is over. Your emperor has ordered surrender. You followed your code with honor. You fought bravely. But the fighting is finished." The prisoners remained silent. They'd heard rumors of Japan's surrender, but didn't know whether to believe them. Kenworthy continued. "In America, when warriors stop fighting, they eat together. They share stories. They remember the fallen and celebrate the living. You are no longer our enemies. You are men who fought for their country and have now laid down their arms. Will you eat with us?" The silence that followed felt like physical pressure. Japanese military culture had no framework for this. Officers ate separately from enlisted men. Guards ate separately from prisoners. The hierarchy was absolute. But here stood an American major, dressed like a civilian, asking enemy soldiers to share his table. Ogawa felt something break inside his chest. For 18 months, he'd maintained his dignity through ritual silence. He'd eaten American food, received American medicine, even learned some American words. But he'd kept his distance, preserved his identity as a Japanese soldier temporarily in enemy custody. Now this American was offering something far more dangerous than kindness. He was offering equality. 30 seconds passed. A minute. Then, Ogawa stepped forward. He'd been a warrant officer in the Imperial Army, responsible for 47 men. 23 had died at Saipan. The rest had watched him surrender. Their faces twisted with contempt and shame. He'd carried that shame for 18 months, a weight that pressed down on his shoulders every morning when he woke. Now, he walked 3 paces forward, stopped before Major Kenworthy, and executed a perfect bow. The kind of bow reserved for honoring superiors. The kind that acknowledged not just rank, but respect. Then, he sat at the nearest table. The dam broke. Sergeant Hiroaki Tanaka followed. Then Private Masato Kimura. Then whole ranks of prisoners, breaking formation and moving toward tables where American guards were already sitting. Captain Brennan watched in amazement as 1,200 Japanese POWs, men who had maintained rigid military bearing through everything, dissolved into a crowd of individuals choosing where to sit, who to sit with, whether to take the bench or the end of the table. Guards who'd watched these prisoners for months suddenly found themselves face to face with the enemy at arm's length. Private James Henderson from Nebraska sat across from 3 Japanese soldiers who'd been part of the force that attacked Guadalcanal. Corporal Michael O'Brien from Boston shared a table with men who might have killed his brother at Tarawa. The food arrived on rolling carts, not prison rations delivered by mess staff. Family-style serving bowls that required passing and sharing. Roasted chicken, mashed potatoes, green beans, fresh bread. And in the center of each table, something that made every Japanese prisoner stop and stare. Ice cream. Vanilla ice cream in metal bowls with condensation running down the sides. Sergeant Shoichi Sato stared at the white substance like it might be poison. He'd heard about ice cream from other prisoners, the legendary American frozen dessert that seemed to appear everywhere, even in combat zones. But seeing it in person felt surreal. The American guard across from him, a kid who couldn't be older than 20, spooned some into a bowl and passed it over. "Try it," the guard said, gesturing. "Vanilla. Good." Sato took a tentative bite.
The sweetness hit him like a physical blow. He'd eaten sugar in prison. The Americans put it in everything. But this was different. This was cold and smooth and impossibly rich. This was abundance made into dessert. He looked up to find the American guard watching him with an expression that took Sato a moment to recognize. Pride. The kid was proud to be sharing this. Proud of what his country could produce. Proud to be American. And in that moment, Sato understood something that made his 18 months of shame suddenly make sense. These Americans weren't just feeding prisoners. They weren't just following Geneva Convention rules or trying to extract intelligence. They genuinely believed that treating enemies with dignity was right. They believed it so deeply that a 20-year-old guard felt personal pride in watching a Japanese prisoner taste ice cream. The war wasn't just over. America had already won. Not through superior firepower or industrial capacity, but through making their enemies want to become them. Around the yard, conversations began. Halting at first, using hand gestures and broken phrases. But then, someone produced a Japanese English dictionary, and someone else found photos of family, and suddenly, 200 men who'd been trained to see each other as subhuman were discovering they had the same stories. American Sergeant William Foster showed pictures of his 2 daughters to Private Takeshi Yamada, who pulled out a battered photo of his own son. Neither man spoke the other's language, but they both understood the universal grammar of fatherhood. The pride, the fear, the desperate hope that children would inherit a better world. Corporal Masao Watanabe found himself sitting next to the American guard who'd been assigned to his barracks for 3 months. They'd never spoken beyond mandatory exchanges. Now the guard, a farm kid from Iowa, was trying to explain baseball using a napkin and salt shakers for bases. Watanabe didn't understand the rules, but he understood the guard's enthusiasm. He'd felt the same way teaching neighborhood kids sumo wrestling before the war. The recognition of that shared humanity, the simple joy of explaining something you loved to someone who might care, brought tears to his eyes. Major Kenworthy watched from the edge of the yard, knowing his career might end tomorrow when his superiors learned what he'd done. But watching Japanese prisoners laughing, actually laughing, at an American guard's terrible joke, he knew it was worth it. This was the war Japan couldn't win. Not the industrial war of steel and oil, but the ideological war of what nations stood for, of dignity, compassion, and the persuasive power of treating people as human beings. Private First Class Hideo Kubota sat in the barracks at Camp Livingston, holding a pencil stub and a scrap of paper he'd traded for. The letter took him 3 hours to write in careful English characters. Food good, no torture. Americans keep word. Surrender if you can. He folded it into a cigarette pack. 2 weeks later, an American officer told him 3 Japanese soldiers on Okinawa had surrendered carrying that exact message. They'd found it on a dead courier. Kubota's contraband letter had saved 3 lives. By August 1945, intelligence officers counted 47 similar notes, captured from Japanese positions. Each one praised American treatment. Each one urged surrender. Japanese commanders executed men for spreading defeatist propaganda. But the letters kept coming. On August 12th, an entire platoon, 32 men, walked into American lines on Okinawa, carrying a handwritten note that said simply, "Americans feed prisoners. This is true. We come now." The impact was measurable. From January to March 1945, Japanese surrender rates held at 4%. From June to August, they jumped to 35%, nearly 9 times higher. Intelligence reports noted the pattern. Prisoners who wrote letters came from units with the highest subsequent surrender rates. The words of men who'd experienced American camps carried more weight than any propaganda leaflet. Colonel Donald Nugent sat in the Pentagon reading these reports with something approaching awe. "We're winning a second war," he told his staff. "Not with bullets, with dinner plates." The cost analysis showed American POW operations ran $3.50 per prisoner per day. Expensive,
but cheaper than the ammunition needed to kill them. The strategic value proved immeasurable. Every prisoner who wrote home about decent treatment became a recruiting tool for surrender. Nugent understood what many didn't. These men aren't just prisoners, they're witnesses. When this war ends, they'll return to Japan carrying proof that American values aren't propaganda. But the Pentagon brass missed something crucial. The Japanese prisoners were physically healthy, gaining 20 to 40 pounds, recovering from wounds, eating better than they had in years. Yet emotionally, they remained broken. Camp commanders reported the same observation. Prisoners ate in silence, worked without complaint, followed every order, but their eyes stayed hollow. The shame of capture had healed their bodies while crushing their spirits. Camp Shelby, Mississippi, housed 1,200 Japanese POWs by July 1945. Major Robert Kenworthy walked the compound each evening, watching men who shuffled like ghosts. They were alive, fed, safe, and utterly empty inside. Kenworthy had grown up on a Montana ranch where his father taught him a simple rule. When the roundup's done, cowboys eat together. Doesn't matter whose brand you rode for. Work's finished, you're all just men. That philosophy gnawed at Kenworthy as he watched his prisoners. The American strategy had saved their lives, but it hadn't given them back their humanity. On August 15, 1945, Kenworthy received word that Japan had surrendered. The war was over. He stood in his office, staring at the memo, and made a decision that violated at least 6 regulations. He called his senior NCOs together and explained his plan. Sergeant William Foster, a Georgia veteran who'd lost friends at Guadalcanal, listened in silence. Then he said, "Sir, if we're gonna do this thing, we better do it right. Real dinner. None of that mess hall slop." Kenworthy spent $240
of discretionary funds, equivalent to $4,200 today, on supplies. At 1700 hours, guards set up tables outside. Not the usual separate areas for prisoners and Americans, shared tables, long ones, like a family reunion. At 1730, Kenworthy assembled the entire prisoner population in formation. He'd shed his uniform for civilian clothes, a deliberate choice. He wanted to speak to them not as a commander addressing enemy soldiers, but as one human being to others. Through his interpreter, he announced Japan's surrender. The prisoners stood motionless. Some wept silently. Most stared at the ground. Then Kenworthy said the words that would echo through their lives. "The war is over. You fought with honor. You followed your code. In my country, when the fighting stops, warriors eat together. Will you eat with us?" 30 seconds of absolute silence. Kenworthy's heart hammered. His career depended on what happened next. More than that, something harder to name depended on this moment. Warrant Officer Kiyoshi Ogawa stepped forward. He was 42 years old, a career soldier who'd fought in China and the Philippines. He had been captured on Iwo Jima with Captain Suzuki, had endured the same shame, carried the same burden. Now he faced a choice that seemed impossible: accept the invitation and betray every teaching of his warrior code, or refuse and remain forever trapped in the prison of his own dishonor. Ogawa bowed deeply. Then he walked to the nearest table and sat down. The dam broke. Sergeant Hiroaki Tanaka moved next, then Private Masato Kimura, then dozens more. Within 5 minutes, all 200 Japanese POWs sat at tables alongside their American guards. The cooks brought out roasted chicken, mashed potatoes with gravy, green beans, fresh bread, and ice cream, vanilla ice cream, 3 gallons of it, enough for every man to have a bowl. Sergeant Shoichi Sato, who'd recovered from malaria in American care, tasted ice cream for the first time in his life. The cold sweetness shocked him. He looked up to see an American corporal, Michael O'Brien, a Boston Irish kid with red hair, grinning at him. O'Brien made an exaggerated gesture of satisfaction, rubbing his belly. Despite himself, despite everything, Sato smiled. Down the table, Private James Henderson from Nebraska showed photographs to Private Takeshi Yamamoto. Neither spoke the other's language, but the photos told the story. Henderson's wife, his baby daughter, his farm back home. Yamamoto pulled out his own photograph, creased and worn, carried through hell, of his parents in Hokkaido. Henderson studied it carefully, then nodded with understanding that crossed every barrier. He pointed to Yamamoto's father and gave a thumbs up. Old man looked strong, tough. Yamamoto's throat tightened. At another table, Corporal William Foster taught 3 Japanese prisoners the basics of baseball using a dinner roll as a ball. The concept of hitting something with a stick and then running in a circle mystified them until Foster demonstrated by actually running around the table. The absurdity broke them. Laughter, genuine laughter, rippled through men who hadn't laughed in months. Kenworthy walked among the tables, watching something extraordinary unfold. The silence that had defined these men for months was breaking apart. Prisoners who'd spoken only when required were attempting English phrases. Thank you. Good food. Very good. Americans responded with grins and more food. The chicken vanished. The potatoes vanished. The ice cream disappeared so fast, the cooks brought out 2 more gallons. Ogawa sat across from Sergeant Foster. Through broken English and gestures, they discovered they were both fathers. Foster's 3 kids in Georgia. Ogawa's 2 sons somewhere in Japan, if they'd survived. Foster showed photos. Ogawa had none. They'd been lost when he was captured, but he drew crude sketches on a napkin. 2 boys. Foster understood. He pulled out a spare photograph of his oldest son and gave it to Ogawa. For you. Remember, being a father, that's the same everywhere. Ogawa held that photograph like it was made of gold. Tears ran down his weathered face. Thank you, he whispered in English. Thank you. By 2100 hours, the tables looked like a tornado had hit them. Empty plates everywhere. Guards and prisoners sat together in the gathering darkness, full and content. Some Americans taught prisoners card games. Some prisoners showed Americans how to fold paper into cranes, the origami they'd learned as children. The barriers that seemed permanent had dissolved in 4 hours of shared humanity. Private Hideo Kubota, who'd written that first contraband letter, sat between 2 American privates from Iowa. They were trying to explain corn farming using hand gestures. Kubota didn't fully understand, but he nodded and smiled. One of the Iowans noticed Kubota eyeing the last piece of bread on a nearby plate. Without hesitation, he grabbed it and handed it to Kubota. Just gave it away. Didn't want anything in return. Kubota took the bread and understood, finally understood, what made these Americans different. They had abundance, and they shared it freely. There was no calculation, no dominance, just simple generosity. That night, lying in his bunk, Kubota couldn't sleep. His mind kept returning to those tables, to the American guards eating the same food from the same pots, to the photograph of Foster's son that Ogawa clutched like a sacred object. The imperial propaganda had been thorough, comprehensive, total. Americans were demons. Americans were cruel. Americans were barbarians. Every single word had been a lie. More than that, his own government had known the truth. Japanese intelligence officers had interrogated prisoners returned in exchanges. They knew how Americans treated captives. They'd known and they'd lied anyway, because the truth was too dangerous. If Japanese soldiers knew they'd be fed, healed, treated, with dignity, how many would choose to live instead of die? Across the barracks, Ogawa sat writing by candlelight. Another letter, this one addressed to no one in particular, meant to be found by whoever came looking. I have been prisoner of Americans for 5 months. They defeated our army with their weapons, but they defeated our spirit with their kindness. Tonight, we ate as equals with the men who guard us. They showed us photographs of their families. They gave us ice cream. They treated us not as conquered enemies, but as fellow human beings who happened to fight on different sides. If this is what American victory looks like, then perhaps we lost to the right enemy. The letter made it back to Japan through Red Cross channels in September 1945. It was published in a Tokyo newspaper on September 24th. Within a week, 200 former POWs added their signatures to it. Major Kenworthy faced a reprimand from his superior officer for unauthorized expenditure of funds and violation of prisoner separation protocols. The reprimand went into his file alongside a commendation from General Douglas MacArthur himself.